Tirpitz was the second of two Bismarck-class battleships built for Nazi Germany's Kriegsmarine during World War II. Named after Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, the architect of the Kaiserliche Marine, the ship was laid down at the Kriegsmarinewerft Wilhelmshaven in November 1936 and her hull was launched 2.5 years later. Work was completed in February 1941, when she was commissioned into the German fleet. Like her sister ship Bismarck, Tirpitz was armed with a main battery of 8 38-centimeter guns in 4 twin turrets. After a series of wartime modifications, she was 2,000 metric tons heavier than Bismarck, making her the heaviest battleship ever built by a European navy. After completing sea trials in early 1941, Tirpitz briefly served as the centerpiece of the Baltic Fleet, which was intended to prevent a possible breakout attempt by the Soviet Baltic Fleet. In early 1942, the ship sailed to Norway to act as a deterrent against an Allied invasion. While stationed in Norway, Tirpitz was also intended to be used to intercept Allied convoys to the Soviet Union, and 2 such missions were attempted in 1942. Tirpitz acted as a fleet in being, forcing the British Royal Navy to retain significant naval forces in the area to contain the battleship. In September 1943, Tirpitz, along with the battleship Skarnest, bombarded Allied positions on Spitsbergen, the only time the ship used her main battery in an offensive role. Shortly thereafter, the ship was damaged in an attack by British mini-submarines and subsequently subjected to a series of large-scale air raids. On November 12, 1944, British Lancaster bombers equipped with 12,000-pound tallboy bombs scored 2 direct hits and a near miss which caused the ship to capsize rapidly. A deck fire spread to the ammunition magazine for one of the main battery turrets, which caused a large explosion. Figures for the number of men killed in the attack range from 950 to 1,204. Between 1948 and 1957 the wreck was broken up by a joint Norwegian and German salvage operation. Construction and characteristics. Tirpitz was ordered as Ersatz Schleswig-Holstein as a replacement for the old pre-dreadnought Schleswig-Holstein, under the contract name G. The Kriegsmarinewerft shipyard in Wilhelmshaven was awarded the contract, where the keel was laid on October 20, 1936. The hull was launched on April 1, 1939. During the elaborate ceremonies, the ship was christened by the daughter of Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, the ship's namesake. Adolf von Trotha, a former admiral in the Imperial German Navy, spoke at the ship's launching, which was also attended by Adolf Hitler. Fitting out work followed her launch, and was completed by February 1941. British bombers repeatedly attacked the harbour in which the ship was being built. No bombs struck Tirpitz, but the attacks did slow construction work. Tirpitz was commissioned into the fleet on February 25 for sea trials, which were conducted in the Baltic. Tirpitz displaced 42,980 as built and 52,600 metric tons fully loaded, with a length of 251 am, a beam of 36 am and a maximum draft of 10.6 am. She was powered by 3 Brown, Bavarian sea-geared steam turbines and 12 oil-fired Wagner superheated boilers, which developed a total of 163,026 shaft horsepower and yielded a maximum speed of 30.8 kn on speed trials. Her standard crew numbered 103 officers and 1,962 enlisted men. During the war this was increased to 108 officers and 2,500 men. As built, Tirpitz was equipped with Model 23 search radars mounted on the forward, foretop, and rear rangefinders. These were later replaced with Model 27 and then Model 26 radars, which had a larger antenna array. A Model 30 radar, known as the Hohndriel, was mounted in 1944 in her topmast, and a Model 213 WA-1/4 LZBURG fire control radar was added on her stern 10.5 cm flak rangefinders. She was armed with 8 38 cm SKC/34L/52 guns arranged in 4 twin-gun turrets, 2 super-firing turrets forward Euro Anton and Brunauer Euro, and 2 after Euro Caesar and Dora. Her secondary armament consisted of 12 15 cm L/55 guns, 1610.5 ACML/65 and 16.3.7 ACML/83, and initially 12 2 ACM anti-aircraft guns. The number of 2 ACM guns was eventually increased to 58. After 1942, 8 53.3 ACM above-water torpedo tubes were installed. The ship's main belt was 320 mm thick and was covered by a pair of upper and main armor decks that were 50 mm and 100 to 120 mm thick, respectively. The 38 ACM turrets were protected by 360 mm thick faces and 220 mm thick sides. Service history: after sea trials, Tirpitz was stationed in Kiel and performed intensive training in the Baltic. While the ship was in Kiel, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. A temporary Baltic fleet was created to prevent the possible breakout of the Soviet fleet based in Leningrad. Tirpitz was briefly made the flagship of the squadron, which consisted of the heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer, the light cruisers Karl Paragraph LN, now 1/4 RNBERG, Leipzig, and Emden, several destroyers, and 2 flotillas of minesweepers. The Baltic Fleet, under the command of Admiral Otto Ciliax, patrolled off the Åland Islands from 23 to September 26, 1941, after which the unit disbanded and Tirpitz resumed training. During the training period, Tirpitz tested her primary and secondary guns on the old pre-dreadnought battleship Hessen, which had been converted into a radio-controlled target ship. The British Royal Air Force continued to launch unsuccessful bombing raids on Tirpitz while she was stationed in Kiel. Deployment to Norway. Admiral Erik Roeder, the commander of the Kriegsmarine, proposed on November 13 that Tirpitz be deployed to Norway. The ship would be able to attack convoys bound for the Soviet Union, as well as act as a fleet in being to tie down British naval assets and deter an Allied invasion of Norway. Hitler, who had forbidden an Atlantic sortie after the loss of Bismarck, agreed to the proposal. The ship was taken into dock for modifications for the deployment. The ship's anti-aircraft battery was strengthened and the 10.5 ACM guns on the superstructure next to the catapult were moved outboard to increase their field of fire. The 2 quadruple 53.3 ACM torpedo tube mounts were also installed during this refit. The ship's commander, Kapita Currency Enzer C. Karl Top, pronounced the ship ready for combat operations on January 10, 1942. The following day, Tirpitz left for Wilhelmshaven, a move designed to conceal her actual destination. The ship left Wilhelmshaven at 23 o'clock on January 14 and made for Trondheim. British military intelligence, which was capable of decrypting the Enigma messages sent by the German Navy, detected the departure of the vessel, but poor weather in Britain prevented action by the RAF. Admiral John Tovey, the Commander-in-Chief of the British Home Fleet, was not made aware of Tirpitz' activities until January 17, well after the ship had arrived in Norway. On January 16, British aerial reconnaissance located the ship in Trondheim. Tirpitz then moved to the Fartanad, just north of Trondheim. The movement was codenamed Operation Polarnacht. The battleship was escorted by the destroyers Z4 Richard Beitzen, Z5 Paul Jacobi, Z8 Bruno Heinemann and Z29 for the voyage. She was moored next to a cliff, which protected the ship from air attacks from the southwest. The ship's crew cut down trees and placed them aboard Tirpitz to camouflage her. Additional anti-aircraft batteries were installed around the field, as were anti-torpedo nets and heavy booms in the entrance to the anchorage. Life for the crew of Tirpitz was very monotonous during the deployment to Norway. Frequent fuel shortages curtailed training and kept the battleship and her escorts moored behind their protective netting. The crew was primarily occupied with maintaining the ship and continuously manning anti-aircraft defenses. Sports activities were organized to keep the crew occupied and physically fit. Operations against Allied convoys. Several factors served to restrain Tirpitz's freedom of operation in Norway. The most pressing were shortages of fuel and the withdrawal of the German destroyer forces to support Operation Cerberus, the movement of the battleship Skarnest and Nisenor and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen up through the English Channel. These caused a planned attack against the outbound convoy PQ-8 at the end of January to be abandoned. A planned British air attack at the end of January by 4-engined heavy bombers was disrupted by poor weather over the target, which prevented the aircraft from finding the ship. In early February, Tirpitz took part in the deceptions that distracted the British in the run-up to Operation Cerberus. These included steaming out of the field and the appearance of preparations for a sortie into the North Sea. Later that month, the ship was reinforced by the heavy cruisers Admiral Scheer and Prinz-Eugen and several destroyers. Prinz-Eugen had been torpedoed by a British submarine at the entrance to the Vartanad, and was therefore temporarily out of action. In March 1942 Tirpitz and Admiral Scheer, along with the destroyers Z-14 Friedrich IHN, Z-5 Paul Jacobi, Z-7 Hermann Sherman and Z-25 and a pair of torpedo boats, were intended to attack the homebound convoy QPA-8 and the outbound PQA-12 as part of Operation Sportpalast. Admiral Scheer, with a design speed of 26 kn, was too slow to operate with Tirpitz, and was left in port, as was the destroyer Paul Jacobi. The two torpedo boats were also released from the operation. On March 5, Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft spotted PQ-812 near Jan Mayen Island. The reconnaissance failed to note the battleship HMSA Duke of York or the battler cruiser HMSA Renown, both of which escorted the convoy, along with 4 destroyers. Unknown to the Germans, Admiral Tovey provided distant support to the convoys with the battleship HMSA King George V, the aircraft carrier HMSA Victorious, the heavy cruiser HMSA Berwick, and 6 destroyers. Enigma intercepts again forewarned the British of Tirpitz-Euro-S attack, which allowed them to reroute the convoys. Admiral Tovey attempted to pursue Tirpitz on March 9, but Admiral Otto Ciliax, the commander of the German squadron, had decided to return to port the previous evening. An air attack was launched early on the 9th. 12 Van albacore torpedo bombers attacked the ship in 3 groups, and Tirpitz successfully evaded the torpedoes. Only 3 men were wounded in the attack. Tirpitz-Euro-S anti-aircraft gunners shot down 2 of the British aircraft. After the conclusion of the attack, Tirpitz made for Vestad, and from there to Trondheim, arriving on the evening of March 13. On March 30, 33 Halifax bombers attacked the ship. They scored no hits and 5 aircraft were shot down. The RAF launched a pair of unsuccessful strikes in late April. On the night of 27 April 28, 31 Halifaxes and 12 Lancasters. 5 of the bombers were shot down. Another raid, composed of 23 Halifaxes and 11 Lancasters, took place the following night. 2 of the bombers were shot down by the German anti-aircraft defences. The actions of Tirpitz and her escorting destroyers in March used up 8,230 metric tons of fuel oil, which greatly reduced the available fuel supply. It took the Germans 3 months to replenish the fuel spent in the attempt to intercept the 2 Allied convoys. Convoy PQ-17, which left Iceland on June 27 bound for the Soviet Union, was the next convoy targeted by Tirpitz and the rest of the German fleet stationed in Norway, during Operation Ra-Paragraph-Selsprung. Escorting the convoy were the battleships Duke of York and Hussar Washington and the carrier Victorious. Tirpitz, Admiral Hipper, and 6 destroyers sortied from Trondheim, while a second task force consisting of La 1 Quartet Zo, Admiral Scheer, and 6 destroyers operated out of Narvik and Bojanad. La 1 Quartet Zo and 3 of the destroyers struck and charted rocks while en route to the rendezvous and had to return to port. Shortly after Tirpitz left Norway, the Soviet submarine K-21 fired 2 or 4 torpedoes at the ship, all of which missed. The Soviets claimed 2 hits on the battleship. Swedish intelligence had meanwhile reported the German departures to the British Admiralty, which ordered the convoy to disperse. Aware that they had been detected, the Germans aborted the operation and turned over the attack to U-boats and the Luftwaffe. The scattered vessels could no longer be protected by the convoy escorts, and the Germans sank 21 of the 34 isolated transports. Tirpitz returned to Altaid via the Lofoten Islands. Following Operation Ra Paragraph Cellsprung, the Germans moved Tirpitz to Bogenad near Narvik. By this time, the ship needed a major overhaul. Hitler had forbidden the ship to make the dangerous return to Germany, and so the overhaul was conducted in Trondheim. On October 23, the ship left Bogenad and returned to Fartanad outside Trondheim. The defences of the anchorage were further strengthened. Additional anti-aircraft guns were installed and double anti-torpedo nets were erected around the vessel. The repairs were conducted in limited phases, such that Tirpitz would remain partially operational for the majority of the overhaul. A caisson was built around the stern to allow the replacement of the ship's rudders. During the repair process, the British attempted to attack the battleship with 2 Chariot human torpedoes, but before they could be launched, rough seas caused the human torpedoes to break away from the fishing vessel which was towing them. By December 28, the overhaul had been completed, and Tirpitz began sea trials. She conducted gunnery trials on January 4, 1943 in the Trondheimad. On February 21, Top was promoted to Rear Admiral and was replaced by Captain Hans Meyer. 5 days later the battleship Skarnest was ordered to reinforce the fleet in Norway. Vice Admiral Oskar Kamitz was given command of the warships stationed in Norway. By the time Skarnest arrived in Norway in March 1943, Allied convoys to the Soviet Union had temporarily ceased. To give the ships an opportunity to work together, Admiral Karl Dar Paragraph Nitz, who had replaced Roeder in the aftermath of the Battle of the Barents Sea on December 31, 1942, ordered an attack on the island of Spitsbergen, which housed a British weather station and refueling base. Several settlements and outposts on Spitsbergen were defended by a garrison of 152 men from the Norwegian armed forces in exile. The 2 battleships, escorted by 10 destroyers, left port on September 6. In a ruse de guerre, Tirpitz flew the white ensign on the approach to the island the following day. During the bombardment, Tirpitz fired 52 main battery shells and 82 rounds from her 15 ACM secondaries. This was the first and only time the ship fired her main battery at an enemy target. An assault force destroyed shore installations and captured 74 prisoners. By 11:00, the battleships had destroyed their targets and headed back to their Norwegian ports. British attacks on Tirpitz. Operation Source. The British were determined to neutralize Tirpitz and remove the threat she posed to Allied lines of communication in the Arctic. Following the repeated, ineffectual bombing attacks and the failed Chariot attack in October 1942, the British turned to the newly designed X-craft midget submarines. The planned attack, Operation Source, included attacks on Tirpitz, Skarnest, and Lowankortet. The X-craft were towed by large submarines to their destinations, where they could slip under anti-torpedo nets to each drop 2 powerful 2-ton mines on the seabed under the bottom of the target. 10 vessels were assigned to the operation, scheduled for September 25, 1943. Only 8 of the vessels reached Norway for the attack, which began early on September 22. 3 of the vessels, X5, X6, and X7, successfully breached Tirpitz Euro's defences. 2 of which X6 and X7 managed to lay their mines. X5 was detected some 200 am from the nets and sunk by a combination of gunfire and depth charges. The mines caused extensive damage to the ship. The first exploded abreast of turret Caesar and the second detonated 45 to 55 am off the port bow. A fuel oil tank was ruptured, shell plating was torn, a large indentation was formed in the bottom of the ship and bulkheads in the double bottom buckled. Some 1,430 AT of water flooded the ship in fuel tanks and void spaces in the double bottom of the port side, which caused a list of 1 to 2 degrees, which was balanced by counter-flooding on the starboard side. The flooding damaged all of the turbo generators in generator room number 2, and all apart from one generator in generator room number 1 were disabled by broken steam lines or severed power cables. Turret Dora was thrown from its bearings and could not be rotated. This was particularly significant, as there were no heavy lift cranes in Norway powerful enough to lift the turret and place it back on its bearings. The ship's two Aradour 196 Float planes were thrown by the explosive concussion and completely destroyed. Repairs were conducted by the repair ship Newmark. Historians William Garsk and Robert Dulin remarked that the successful repair effort was one of the most notable feats of naval engineering during the Second World War. Repairs lasted until April 2, 1944. Full-speed trials were scheduled for the following day in Altaird. Operation Tungsten. The British were aware that Newmark and the repair crews left in March, which intimated Tirpitz was nearly operational. A major airstrike Operation Tungsten involving the fleet carriers Victorious and Furious and the escort carriers Emperor, Fencer, Pursuer, and Searcher, was set for April 4, 1944, but rescheduled a day earlier when Enigma decrypts revealed that Tirpitz was to depart at 5:29 on April 3 for sea trials. The attack consisted of 40 Barracuda dive bombers carrying 1,600-pound armor-piercing bombs and 40 escorting fighters in two waves, scoring 15 direct hits and 2 near misses. The aircraft achieved surprise, and only one was lost in the first wave. It took 12 to 14 minutes for all of Tirpitz's anti-aircraft batteries to be fully manned. The first wave struck at 5:29, as tugs were preparing to assist the ship out of her mooring. The second wave arrived over the target an hour later, shortly after 06:30. Despite the alertness of the German anti-aircraft gunners, only one other bomber was shot down. The airstrike caused significant damage to the ship and inflicted serious casualties. William Garsk and Robert Dulin report the attack killed 122 men and wounded 316 others, while Hildebrand, Ra paragraph HR, and Steinmetz report 132 fatalities and 270 wounded men, including the ship's commander, KZS Hans Mayer. 2 of the 15 ACM turrets were destroyed by bombs and both the 196 Float planes were destroyed. Several of the bomb hits caused serious fires aboard the ship. Concussive shock disabled the starboard turbine engine and salt water used to fight the fires reached the boilers and contaminated the feed water. Some 2,000 AT of water flooded the ship, primarily through the 2 holes in the side shell created by shell splinters from near misses. Water used to fight the fires also contributed to the flooding. Dar paragraph Nitz ordered the ship be repaired, regardless of the cost, despite the fact that he understood Tirpitz could no longer be used in a surface action because of insufficient fighter support. Repair work began in early May. Destroyers ferried important equipment and workers from Kiel to Altaird over the span of 3 days. By June 2, the ship was again able to steam under her own power, and by the end of the month gunnery trials were possible. During the repair process, the 15 ACM guns were modified to allow their use against aircraft, and specially fused 38 ACM shells for barrage anti-aircraft fire were supplied. Operations Planet, Brawn, Tiger Claw, Mascot and Goodwood. A series of carrier strikes was planned over the next 3 months, but bad weather forced their cancellation. A repeat of Operation Tungsten, codenamed Operation Planet, was scheduled for April 24. Operation Brawn, which was to have been carried out by 27 bombers and 36 fighters from Victorious and Furious, was to have taken place on May 15, and Operation Tiger Claw was intended for May 28. Victorious and Furious were joined by Indefatigable for Operation Mascot, which was to have been carried out on July 17 by 62 bombers and 30 fighters. The weather finally broke in late August, which saw the Goodwood series of attacks. Operations Goodwood I and II were launched on August 22. A carrier force consisting of the fleet carriers Furious, Indefatigable and Formidable and the escort carriers Nabob and Trumpeter launched a total of 38 bombers and 43 escort fighters between the 2 raids. The attacks failed to inflict any damage on Tirpitz, and 3 of the attacking aircraft were shot down. Goodwood III followed on August 24, composed of aircraft from the fleet carriers only. 48 bombers and 29 fighters attacked the ship and scored 2 hits which caused minor damage. 1. a 1,600-pound bomb, penetrated the upper and lower armor decks and came to rest in the No. 4 switchboard room. Its fuse had been damaged and the bomb did not detonate. The second, a 500-pound bomb, exploded but caused only superficial damage. 6 planes were shot down in the attack. Goodwood 4 followed on the 29th, with 34 bombers and 25 fighters from Formidable and Indefatigable. Heavy fog prevented any hits from being scored. 1 Firefly and a Corsair were shot down by Tirpitz Euro-S gunners. The battleship expended 54 rounds from her main guns, 161 from the 15 ACM guns and up to 20% of her light anti-aircraft ammunition. Operations Paravan and Obviate. The ineffectiveness of the great majority of the strikes launched by the Fleet Air Arm in mid-1944 led to the task of Tirpitz Euro-S destruction being transferred to the RAF's No. 5 Group. The RAF used Lancaster bombers to carry 6 short-ton tallboy bombs to penetrate the ship's heavy armor. The first attack, Operation Paravan, took place on September 15, 1944. Operating from a Ford base at Yagodnik in Russia, 23 Lancasters scored a single hit on the ship's bow. The tallboy penetrated the ship, exited the keel, and exploded in the bottom of the fjord. 800 to 1,000 AT of water flooded the bow and caused a serious increase in trim forward. The ship was rendered unseaworthy and was limited to 8 to 10 kN. Concussive shock caused severe damage to fire control equipment. The damage persuaded the Naval Command to repair the ship for use only as a floating gun battery. Repair work was estimated to take 9 months, but patching of the holes could be effected within a few weeks, allowing Tirpitz to be moved further south to Tromsø. On October 15, the ship made the 200 mi trip to Tromsø under her own power, the last voyage of her career. The RAF made a second attempt on October 29, after the ship was moored off Hyenkaia Island outside Tromsø. 32 Lancasters attacked the ship with tallboys during Operation Obviate. As on Operation Paravan, No. 9 Squadron and No. 617 Squadron carried out the attack together, which resulted in only 1 near miss, partially the result of bad weather over the target. The underwater explosion damaged the port rudder and shaft and caused some flooding. Tirpitz Euro-S 38 ACM fragmentation shells proved ineffective in countering the high-level bombers. 1 aircraft was damaged by ground-based anti-aircraft guns. Following the attack, the ship's anchorage was significantly improved. A large sandbank was constructed under and around the ship to prevent her from capsizing and anti-torpedo nets were installed. Tirpitz retained a 1-degree list to port from earlier damage, and this was not corrected by counter-flooding to retain as much reserve buoyancy as possible. The ship was also prepared for her role as a floating artillery platform. Fuel was limited to only what was necessary to power the turbo generators and the crew was reduced to 1,600 officers and enlisted men. Operation Catechism. Operation Catechism, the final British attack on Tirpitz, took place on November 12, 1944. The ship again used her 38 ACM guns against the bombers, which approached the battleship at 9:35. Tirpitz Euro-S main guns forced the bombers to disperse temporarily, but could not break up the attack. A force of 32 Lancasters from NO's 9 and 617 squadrons dropped 29 tallboys on the ship, with 2 direct hits and 1 near miss. Several other bombs landed within the anti-torpedo net barrier and caused significant cratering of the seabed. This removed much of the sandbank that had been constructed to prevent the ship from capsizing. 1 bomb penetrated the ship's deck between turrets Anton and Bruno but failed to explode. A second hit amidships between the aircraft catapult and the funnel and caused severe damage. A very large hole was blown into the ship's side and bottom. The entire section of belt armor abreast of the bomb hit was completely destroyed. A third bomb may have struck the ship on the port side of turret Caesar. The amidships hit caused significant flooding and quickly increased the port list to between 15 and 20 degrees. In 10 minutes, the list increased to 30 to 40 degrees. The captain issued the order to abandon ship. Progressive flooding increased the list to 60 degrees by 0950, though this appeared to stabilize temporarily. 8 minutes later, a large explosion rocked turret Caesar. The turret roof and part of the rotating structure were thrown 25 am into the air and over into a group of men swimming to shore, crushing them. Tirpitz then rapidly rolled over and buried her superstructure in the sea floor. In the aftermath of the attack, rescue operations attempted to reach men trapped in the hull. Workers rescued 82 men by cutting through the bottom hull plates. Figures for the death toll vary from approximately 950 to 1,204. Approximately 200 survivors of the sinking were transferred to the heavy cruiser La 1 Tirpitz in January 1945. The performance of the Luftwaffe in the defense of Tirpitz was highly criticized after her loss. Major Heinrich Eller, the commander of 3/Jagdgeschwader 5, was blamed for the Luftwaffe's failure to intercept the British bombers. He was subsequently court-martialed in Oslo and threatened with the death penalty. Evidence was shown that his unit had failed to help the Kriegsmarine when requested. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but he was released after a month, demoted, and reassigned to an Me-262 fighter squadron in Germany. Eller was exonerated by further investigations which concluded that the reason behind the fiasco was poor communication between the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe, and the air crews had not been informed that the Tirpitz had been moved off Hayen-Kaya a couple of weeks earlier. The wreck of Tirpitz remained in place until after the war, when a joint German-Norwegian company began salvage operations. Work lasted from 1948 until 1957. Fragments of the ship are still sold by a Norwegian company. Ludovic Kennedy wrote in his history of the vessel that she lived an invalid's life and died a cripple's death. Footnotes. Citations. References. Further reading, Bishop, Patrick. Target Tirpitz, X-Craft, Agents and Ambuscers. The epic quest to destroy Hitler's mightiest warship. Harper Presser. External links. The Battle for Hitler's Supership, aerial photo of the battleship Tirpitz in her anchorage at Cayenne Fjord, Norway. Unpublished photo originated from a private photo album of Soviet Air Force's pilot observer Feodosy Skoryaki. Newsreel about the life and death of the Tirpitz showing RN, FAA and RAF attacks.